It was still dawn when Karima walked through the gates of the military base. The cold air bit into her hands, but she held the mop as if it were a weapon. Every day at 5 in the morning, before the first soldiers arrived for briefing, she was already inside. She wiped down hallways, polished doorknobs, scrubbed floors. Her uniform, an old work smock and salvaged boots. She was 26, with eyes full of silence and a face of a woman who saw more than she told. She came from a small village where the army was a distant dream, and a uniform was a symbol of someone in a higher league. But she had always had something elusive about her, an intuition that her mother had once called the mind of the observer. Everyone knew her on the base, but no one really knew her. She was the garbage girl to the soldiers. Sometimes one would say, "Hey, Mop, pass me a rag." They would laugh. She laughed too, but quietly, only with her mouth. It hurt inside. But Karima listened. She always listened. She knew when they changed the codes at the gates. She knew who had discipline problems and who was playing hero. She knew which officer couldn't read a map, even though he lectured. And she knew something else. In the main building, there was a room with old mission archives. Sometimes in the evening, when no one was looking, she would sit there for a while. She would look through reports, notes, sketches of the terrain. Everything interested her. She would read instructions on how to maneuver a drone, how to command a small unit in the field, how to detect enemy movements in the dark. She had no training, but she had a brain that absorbed knowledge like a sponge, and a motivation stronger than orders. And although no one knew it yet, Karima was not just a cleaner. She was the woman who would soon change the course of the entire operation. The mess hall was a place where the military hierarchy was only superficially blurred. Officers and enlisted men ate at the same tables, but the stares, the whispered comments, the contemptuous smiles still existed. For Karima, it was a minefield, full of stares that spoke louder than words. That day she was carrying a box of dishes to the scullery. Her hands were red from the cold, and her knees ached from the morning shift. As she walked between the tables, she accidentally knocked over one of the chairs. Sergeant Rilski, known for his love of cheap jokes and loud laughter, turned around theatrically. "Attention! Tactical purge!" he shouted, then dropped his cutlery on the floor. "The cleaner versus the table. Who will win?" The hall erupted in laughter. One of the soldiers smacked his lips loudly. "Let her be happy that she has a job. Maybe someone will take pity on her someday." Karima leaned over, picked up the cutlery, but said nothing. Not because she had no answer, but because she knew what their words said about them, not her. She went back to the kitchen and closed the door behind her. There, alone, she collapsed into a chair. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached for the notebook she had hidden under a pile of dishcloths. She began to write. Observation. Rilski, impulsive, disregards procedure. His unit does not follow entry codes, possible security breaches. She wasn't a spy, but her eyes saw everything. Every humiliation became information, every joke a piece of a larger puzzle, and even though everyone laughed at her that day, no one noticed that Karima had just started her own operation. It was night. The silence in the base was almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the generator and the steady crunch of snow under the guards' boots. Karima was on evening duty, cleaning the commander's offices. Theoretically, she was only supposed to empty the bins and wash the floors. Practically, it was her favorite moment of the day. It was then that she could enter the rooms where decisions were made, missions were planned, and maps were laid out. That evening, the door to Major Lewicki's room was just ajar. The light was still on, but no one answered when she knocked. She entered. The desk was full of documents. One of them, carelessly left on the surface, was marked Top Secret, Operation Strix. She couldn't tear her eyes away. She scanned every detail, coordinates, names, dates. Something here didn't feel right. The map she knew from previous documents looked different. One sector was missing. Instinctively, she reached for the piece of paper and then she heard the door creak behind her. It was Lieutenant Kalicki. He looked at her with superiority, frowned. "What are you doing here?" he growled. "Sorry, just taking out the trash," she replied, quickly hiding the mop and turning away. He said nothing more, but his gaze was longer, suspicious. Karima went back to her locker room and immediately wrote down everything she could remember. She already knew something was coming, and that not everyone at the base was playing fair. The next day there was a commotion. One of the documents from the major's office was missing. A quiet inspection was initiated. They suspected someone from the outside. There were whispers of sabotage. Karima was silent, but that night, for the first time, she felt that she was not just a passive witness. Perhaps she was the only person who could prevent the disaster. Within days, the military base had become a fortress of suspicion. Every soldier had to identify himself, even the highest-ranking ones. Entry records were checked, support staff were questioned. Officers moved faster, spoke more quietly. Someone had broken protocol, and they didn't know who. Karima could feel the tension under her skin. She could see the cook watching nervously, the mechanic pretending not to overhear conversations. But they weren't the most important. This place had a structure, and she knew it better than anyone else. She had learned every shortcut, every hidden passage between buildings, every moment of the changing of the guard during her months at the base. She knew what time Lieutenant Kalicki went out for a cigarette and where the technical officer left the keys to the drone locker. She was the shadow of this base, invisible but omnipresent. Some of the information she wrote down in her head, others in a secret notebook hidden behind a metal pipe in the laundry room. None of her notes would be understood by an outsider. They were encoded with symbols and abbreviations she had created herself. One night she overheard a conversation through the warehouse wall. "If the document leaked, the whole operation could be ruined," said a trembling voice. "Someone's messing around here, I'm sure of it. But we have no proof." Karima clenched her fists. "I'm not just digging," she thought. "I know more than you." She returned to her work cell, opened her notebook, and added a new password. Zone 12. Movements after O2 Unjuo. Who? Why? She felt something big was coming. The tension was growing. And although officially she was still just a cleaning lady with a torn apron and a quiet gaze, in reality she was becoming the central figure in a game whose stakes were much higher than anyone had expected. It was dark when the alarm went off. Not the test alarm, but the real one, a long, tearing sound that penetrated the walls and woke from the deepest sleep. Soldiers ran out of the barracks, putting on their jackets and grabbing their weapons as they ran. Red lights flashed like a warning. Something had happened. Karima was just finishing her shift. She had been in the laundry room when she heard the beep. She didn't panic. Instead, she picked up her bag and headed for the fire escape she knew better than anyone. She knew that if this was a test, a real test, she would only get one chance to show what she could do. The command center was in disarray. The main monitor showed unauthorized movement in Zone 12, the same zone Karima had marked in her notebook earlier. Officers shouted at each other. Someone tried to connect to the cameras, but the system froze. "Signal jammed," the technician called out. "Who has access to Zone 12? Asked Major Lewicki, gritting his teeth. Nobody answered. At the same time, Karima scurried down the utility corridor. She knew the emergency power system could be reset manually if anyone knew where the old switchboard was. She got there in a flash. Her hands were shaking, but she remembered the sequence. Green, red, switch, reset. The lights blinked, the monitors came to life, the camera feed returned. The officers looked at the screen and saw Karima. She was standing with a wrench in her hand at the emergency panel. "What the?" whispered Lieutenant Kalicki. "Who let her in there?" "Nobody," the technician replied. She knew the way. The base fell silent. For the first time they looked at her not as a shadow, but as someone who had just saved the operation. Karima returned to the laundry room without a word. She smiled to herself as she put her apron in the cupboard. This was just the beginning. After the incident with Area 12, the base fell silent. Officers made no official statements, but something had changed. A shadow of consternation appeared in the commander's gazes, and some, like Lieutenant Kaliki, began to regard Karimi with growing distrust. At the operational meeting, one question was asked. How did the cleaner know access to the emergency panel? The commander tried to downplay the situation. Maybe a coincidence, maybe someone told her something earlier, but no one believed in coincidences on this base. Here, where everything had its procedures, where even breaths were counted according to the regulations, no one should accidentally know the hidden system box. Karima, meanwhile, had returned to her routine, but deep down she knew what had happened had upset the balance. She was no longer just a cleaner. Now she had become someone to watch. That evening, while she was mopping the floors in the operating room, she saw a folder of reports. She opened it as if by accident, as if it were just a box of printer paper, but inside were transcripts of interviews. Her name was marked in red. He knows the details of the base, access to technical systems. It is not known whether this is a threat or an opportunity. She closed the folder slowly, as if she didn't see anything. But in her head, she began to form a plan. At the same time, one of the senior officers, General Rataj, received a private report. It was an anonymous report. It indicated a potential internal threat, but also suggested that the source might have key information to carry out the Strix mission. No one yet knew who had written the report, but the general decided to take it seriously. Karima had no idea that the very next day she would be summoned, not to clean, but to a secret meeting. Karima didn't sleep that night. Something inside her told her that her time in hiding was over. In the morning, when the sun hadn't yet broken through the fog over the base, she heard a knock on the door of her barracks. Quiet, controlled, determined. She opened it and saw two soldiers in uniforms without ranks. They were different from the rest, silent, attentive. "Please follow us," one of them said. She asked no questions. She followed them through the corridors she had once secretly learned. Now she was guided by the very structure she knew by heart. They stopped in front of a door with the Strix sign, a symbol that was only whispered about. It was said to be a special operations section, operating outside protocol, above command, directly under the orders of the highest authorities. General Rataj was waiting inside. He sat alone at a table, in semi-shadow, with his hands folded. "Karima Afolayan," he began without preamble. "How many months have you been at this base?" "9, she replied quietly, but confidently. "And during that time you know the basic layout, procedures, technical codes, and, most importantly, the behavior of the staff." She was silent. "I know you were trained, not by us, but someone prepared you." She looked into his eyes for the first time, without fear, with only truth. "I prepared myself, because no one else was going to do it for me." The general stood up, walked over to her and put a folder on the table with the following inscription: "Operation Desert Shadow. I want you to lead this. The time for cleaning up is over. Now you set the rules." Karima didn't move. She just lifted her chin slightly. She left the room with a briefcase under her arm. She was no longer a cleaner. She became the leader. Karima was now sitting in the room she used to clean. In front of her was an ID card with a new name. Lieutenant Afolayan, the uniform she had spent years cleaning for others, was now hers. But beneath that new layer, beneath her official rank and mission, something more pulsed within her. Memory. Memories of laughter in the corridors, of soldiers nudging her. How one day Lieutenant Kaliki spilled coffee on the floor and ordered her to wash it on her knees, looking at her with contempt. Memories of the silence they left her in the dining room. Memories of the frost in their eyes as they passed her by without a word, as if she were invisible. And now Now they passed her in silence, but not with indifference, with uncertainty, with a question in their eyes that had not existed before. What is she doing here? Her room, though larger, was stark. Only one photograph, from childhood, with her mother who cleaned offices in Lagos. It was her mother who told her that true strength comes from silence. That one must know all the corners of the world before one can control it. In the afternoon, Major Kowalska came to see her, the only woman in the command who ever looked at Karima without superiority. "You look good in your uniform," she said with a smile, "but I know it's not the uniform that makes the soldier. It's the fire in your eyes, and you are burning." Karima was silent. She knew that the greatest mission was just beginning, and it wasn't just about a covert operation. It was about proving that who you are doesn't depend on where you come from. That evening, she sat down at her desk and opened a file labeled Operations Manual Desert Shadow. The first page had one sentence: Commander Karima Afolayan. She decides. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to ask for permission. Operation Desert Shadow was no ordinary mission. It was a top-secret mission, so complex that it required command outside the standard chain of command. The objectives included seizing a satellite transmission center, eliminating a sabotage unit, and recovering cryptographic data hidden by a former intelligence officer. Karima studied maps, field reports, and satellite data with a precision that was not expected from a former cleaner, but it was her ability to notice details, the same details that had previously helped her survive, that now allowed her to create the perfect plan. At her pre-mission briefing, she was faced with a group of 6 special operators, all of them senior, all of them known for their courage, and all of them were surprised. Some muttered under their breath, others glanced sideways. There was one question in their eyes. "She is supposed to lead us?" But Karima didn't move. She walked in front of them like a general. Her voice was confident. "This mission doesn't require ego. It requires precision. I know you don't know me, but this base knows me. Every nook and cranny, every person. I saw you before you saw me." There was silence. As she unfolded the map and began to describe the plan, their expressions changed. Respect appeared, and curiosity. "If you have a problem with my command, you can leave now. But if you stay, you hear me out." Nobody left. In the evening, before departure, she stood alone on the airport tarmac. She looked into the darkness of the desert, where their future awaited them. And she thought that it all started with laughter, and with a rag to the floor. And now she was leading an elite team on their most important mission of the year. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and said to herself, "I am no longer a shadow. I am a commander." The helicopter left the base at 0312, hidden in the darkness of night and a curtain of sand. The silence was as thick as concrete, and every second was quivering with tension. Karima sat in the front, next to the pilot, holding a tablet with mission data. Behind her, 6 men who, a day earlier, had not believed that a woman with a mop could lead them. Now they were silent, listening. They were approaching Point Alpha, an abandoned fueling station where the data indicated the first contact was hiding. A former military technician who knew the location of the satellite server. But something was wrong. The object was too quiet, too dead. "Transfer on foot. Communications cut off. We take up encirclement positions," Karima ordered. As they approached the building, they saw movement through their night vision goggles. Someone was inside, but it wasn't one person. 3 silhouettes, armed. "A trap," she said quietly but firmly. "We don't fire the first shot. We wait." One of the operators, Sergeant Miltsarek, whispered, "How do you know?" She looked into his eyes and replied, "Because I can hear them breathing. They're nervous. Amateurs. They were left here to provoke us." In seconds, she had the team in a cross formation. In a split second, the first shot was fired, not from them. Karima gave a hand signal, and the team reacted perfectly. 3 opponents incapacitated. one wounded, alive for questioning. After that, there was silence. The operators looked at each other, then at her. The silent man said only one word. "Commander." Karima leaned over the prisoner. Before anyone could say anything, he looked at her in horror and whispered, "You're the shadow." She didn't answer, because it was no longer a shadow, it was a storm. The prisoner they had captured at the gas station was no mere pawn. He had a microchip with encoded coordinates and an identifying mark, belonging to an officer from their own base. As Karima decoded the data, a shadow appeared in her eyes that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, but disappointment. The betrayal did not come from outside. Someone among their people, someone who knew the plan, the route and the targets, sold the information. And he did it again before her appointment as commander. That meant one thing. Someone didn't want her to take control of the operation from the very beginning. In the silence of the operations tent, Karima analyzed the drone data. The time the files moved showed only one person with access, Lieutenant Kaliki, the same one who once called her the walking mop of Lagos. Before she made up her mind, she called out to Milcharek. He was stern, professional, but now, after the events in the field, his gaze carried trust. "I need to know," she began quietly, "if Kaliki was in the broadcast office 3 days ago." The Milcharek did not hesitate. Yes, he claimed he was reviewing operational data, alone, without supervision. Silence. Karima bowed her head. "He betrayed us before this mission even began, and if we don't stop him, this mission will be over before it even begins." She decided to return to the base with one of the operators under the guise of damaging the equipment. Kaliki didn't know that he had been exposed, but Karima knew one thing. In the fight against the shadow, the greatest threat is not the enemy that comes from outside. It's the one standing right next to you with a smile on his face and a knife behind his back. She closed her laptop and said coldly, "There is no room for hesitation in this mission. Tomorrow at dawn, we return." The dawn over the desert was like a cold blade, sharp, unpredictable, piercing. The helicopter with Karima and Sergeant Milcharek landed quietly on the side strip of the base, far from standard procedures. The official reason, navigation system failure. The real goal, confrontation with the traitor. Karima entered the main building as she had so many times before, a shadow that no one noticed, but this time her steps were different. She wasn't just a commander, she was a woman who no longer allowed anyone to tell who she was. Kaliki sat at his desk, reviewing mission reports that were, ironically, supposed to be secret to everyone but her. When Karima opened the door, he looked up, seemingly calm. "Hello, Commander. I heard something broke." "Yes," she replied coldly, "but it wasn't about the helicopter." Milcharek closed the door behind him and stood next to her, never taking his eyes off the lieutenant. "You have something that belongs to us," she said, tossing a microchip recovered from a prisoner onto the desk. "Data from yesterday, signed with your access code." Kaliki paled. His hand quivered slightly. Panic flashed in his eyes. Not the kind you see in battle, the kind that appears when the curtain falls and there's nowhere left to hide. "This must be some mistake." He tried again, but his voice sounded like a shadow of itself. Karima didn't raise her voice. She took her old cleaning lady's ID card, which she always carried with her. She put it next to the chip. "Do you know this number? It was mine. You passed me in the hallway every day. You never asked my name. You don't have to today, because I'm the one asking." Kaliki was silent. Milcharek put handcuffs on him. Everything happened without shouting, quietly, symbolically. Outside, as he was led across the square, the young soldiers looked on in disbelief, and Karima just turned to them and said, "Every base needs cleaning. Sometimes it starts with the floor." Kaliki's betrayal was not the end, it was a warning. The information he managed to pass on could have reached the networks of hostile groups long ago. The satellite server that Karima's team was supposed to take over was most likely already under surveillance. The general staff considered cancelling the mission, but Karima, now officially operational commander, proposed something that surprised everyone. Independent reconnaissance, flighting a fighter plane adapted to fly low over the desert. Nobody's expecting me. Nobody knows how I think. And that's why I'm the only one who can get there without being noticed, she said, standing in the middle of the briefing room. The generals looked at her with concern. To them, she was still the girl with the mop, even if she was already in uniform. But one of them, General Rudnicki, an old pilot with the soul of a strategist, stood up and said, "Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one your opponent has laughed at. Give it what it needs." At dawn, Karima stood on the tarmac, right where she used to wash away the footprints of those who now stood aside and watched in silence. She wore a leather flight suit, sunglasses, and a helmet. Beside her, in a gleaming black fighter, waited a world that always seemed closed. She got in without a word. The mechanic gave her the starting code. Her voice over the radio was firm, clear. "Code active. Shadow ready to fly." "Acknowledged, Shadow. Good luck." The engines roared. The ground beneath her feet shook. And then she soared into the sky. The soldiers looked up in silence. One of them, a young recruit who had thrown a plastic bottle at her a few weeks ago, whispered to himself, "I thought it was just a cleaning lady." Milcharek, standing nearby, replied, "No, he's a war pilot." And somewhere above the desert, in the glow of the rising sun, Karima flew into the darkness, not to escape, but to bring light. The flight was silent, but the tension was deafening. The sun above the desert burned the sky like iron, and the wind lifted clouds of sand like ghosts from the past. Karima, codenamed Shadow, flew low, close to the ground, using every dune as cover. The target was an abandoned communications tower, supposedly dead for years, but the signals picked up by satellite told a different story. The cockpit was dark. Lighting was minimal. The screens were lit only when necessary. The radio was silent. But suddenly, a crackle, an echo, and a voice. "Shadow, this is base. Over. Transmitting. Target in range. Initiating scan," she replied coolly, though her heart was pounding like the wings of a caged bird. The image on the screen flickered. She saw silhouettes on the roof of the tower. 3 people. Enemies. They didn't know she was above them. But what she saw a moment later froze her blood. A truck with the logo of a military base parked behind the tower. Someone from inside was collaborating with the terrorists. And it wasn't just Kaliki. The warning screen flashed. Someone was trying to jam her signal. She switched the system to manual control and made a quick maneuver, disappearing from radar. It was then that she heard the most important sentence of this mission. "This is Alpha Unit. We are confirming location. We are transmitting signal." Karima, realizing that the data could be lost, did something desperate, opened the emergency system and broadcast the entire transmission directly to the base's main channel. She was breaking protocol, but this was no longer the time for rules. "This is Shadow. Transmitting data. Enemy in the tower. Vehicle marked Base 7. Request immediate interception." I repeat, and then everything went silent. Communication was cut off. The screens went blank. The base fell silent. Milcharek stood up abruptly. General Rudnicki whispered, "Did we lose her?" But before anyone answered, a message appeared on the screen. "Transmission completed successfully. Data secured." And then everyone realized that Karima had not only flown into the darkness, she just shed light where others were afraid to look. Hours had passed since the last contact. The base was dead silent. Even those who had mocked Karima not long ago were now speechless. Her last transmission had revealed more than treason. It had exposed a system that had for years been built on contempt for those it did not know. And then, an unexpected echo in the control tower speakers. "This is Shadow. I'm landing. Please take over the runway." The entire tower literally held its breath. Milkzarik, who had been standing still like a statue until then, grabbed the microphone with trembling hands. Shadow, welcome home. The fighter appeared on the horizon like a shadow returning from another world. The landing was perfect. Karima emerged from the cockpit, helmet in hand, desert dust on her face, and eyes that saw more than anyone could understand. Everyone was waiting on the airport tarmac. Soldiers, officers, even generals. But it wasn't their looks that mattered. It was a young girl in an apron, the new cleaner, looked at Karima with tears in her eyes. "You showed us all that we can be more," she whispered. A few hours later, a special ceremony took place. This time it was Karima was in the middle of the room, not in the corner with a mop. They all stood as General Rudnicki handed her the Medal of Military Merit. But before he did, he said the words that would be remembered forever. They say it doesn't matter where you come from, but where you're going. But Karima showed us something more, that true leaders are born in silence, in humility, and among those the world ignores. That day, the world learned the story of a poor girl who was just a cleaning lady until she became commander of the mission that changed the course of the war.